Danny told me the last week of his life that he had gotten most of the evidence he needed, and he had one more meeting in West Virginia.
Tonight from CBS News, a complex and confusing, still developing case.
It's the story of what happened to Inslaw.
That involves improper conduct by high-level Justice Department officials.
I told him here's a very suspicious case involving the Department of Justice, and he just found an astounding amount of stuff that nobody knew beforehand.
It all started with the software and evolved to a much bigger story.
Well, the left arm appeared to have had 8 cuts, and the right arm appeared to have had 4 cuts.
In West Virginia, authorities are investigating the mysterious death of a journalist.
44-year-old Danny Casolaro was found dead over the weekend in a motel in Martinsburg, West Virginia.
And that's when I walked in and saw what I saw. It was just messy.
What was mess?
The bloody handprints all over the wall and smeared on the wallpaper and all over the countertop and just blood everywhere.
Basically what it is we found this guy in a tub full of water with his wrist slit. Okay. And so it's definitely suicide.
Suicide, I was like a little bit taken aback because he had just said to me, if an accident happens, don't believe it.
I remember Danny telling us, if I'm in an accident, if I have an accident, if an accident happens to me, don't believe it, don't believe it, don't believe it.
There were a lot of very bad and very dark and very evil people involved in this story. People that Danny couldn't recognize because he had never been around people like that. So he thought they were characters.
One Sunday evening in 1991, the now award-winning art critic Dan Biscoff received an anonymous phone call. The caller demanded that Biscoff investigate a journalist's disappearance in West Virginia. As the editor of the well-tended Alt Weekly, The Village Voice, he brushed the lead off. Little did he know, this trip was about to become one of the biggest conspiracies in American history.
Walking around doing usual things. Front desk called me on walkie-talkie. They said, we need you in 517. I said, well, what do I need to bring? A toilet plunger or what? They said, your courage.
A day later, on August 12th, news broke out that a man's nude body had been found at the Sheraton Inn in Martinsburg, West Virginia.
And that's when I walked in and saw what I saw. It was just messy. For lack of a better explanation, it was messy.
When the local authorities got there, what they saw was a blood-spattered nightmare. The man had slashed both of his wrists.
Is there anything that appeared suspicious about this to you?
In my 6 years as a medic, I've never seen anybody ever cut their wrists that many times.
And his wrists were cut how many times?
Well, the left arm appeared to have had 8 cuts, and the right arm appeared to have had 4 cuts.
They identified him as J. Daniel Casolaro, a freelance journalist from Virginia. Casolaro was on a mission to expose the U.S. Department of Justice for a series of scandals he dubbed the Octopus.
In West Virginia, authorities are investigating the mysterious death of a journalist.
44-year-old Danny Casolaro was found dead over the weekend in a motel in Martinsburg, West Virginia.
I mean, people always ask me why I'm working on this. And what do you tell them?
Although his death was ruled a suicide, further developments revealed that there was more to his story than met the eye.
You know, if he was murdered, it was for a reason. And that would be that his theory was correct.
Local authorities quickly ruled his death a suicide, but Casolaro's family and colleagues believe he may have been killed.
There is absolutely no way in hell that Dan Casolaro would kill himself.
He was very charged up about the story that he was working on.
And you think he was murdered?
I absolutely believe he was clipped. There's no two ways about it.
Had the government disposed of him because he'd discovered something sinister? Or did life get to him? Let's find out. Casolaro, the son of a close-knit Catholic family of Italian origin, was the oldest of 7 children. Although the family lived in what's considered Virginia horse country today, they weren't hard-pressed. Danny's college education and the fact that one of his brothers was also a doctor testified that the Casolaros didn't have financial problems. That said, the Providence College alumnus graduated in 1968, shortly after he married Terrell Pace, and the pair had a son they nicknamed Trey. After a decade, the pair divorced and Danny got full custody of their son. According to reports, after the divorce, the father-son duo briefly lived in Washington, where Danny pursued a career in writing.
He loved to write fiction.
He wrote a couple books. He wrote poems. You know, Danny and I didn't date for very long, but we stayed the closest of friends. I spent more time with Danny than I did any man in my life ever.
Surprisingly, although his wife was a former Miss Virginia, she's practically unknown outside of the Casolaro case. Could the lack of involvement in the uproar after Danny's death hint at a bad breakup? Possibly, because rumor has it Danny cheated on her. Meanwhile, suggestions that they divorced because Danny could barely make ends meet as a journalist are unfounded. His 3-bedroom property in Fairfax spanned over 3 acres and was estimated at $400,000. This says everything we need to know about his financial condition.
Easter, 1985. Casolaros.
The Casolaros were this huge, very closely knit, big Italian Catholic family. This was a highly successful family.
We want to keep this information in mind because his financial status also crops up in the proceedings following his death. Moving on, as far as Danny's writing career is concerned, the sources vary on whether or not he was the diligent journalist he made himself out to be in his resume. The popular opinion is that he was undistinguished. While his resume boasts that he contributed to newspapers and journals such as World News, The Washington Star, The American Print Journal, and others, Ron Rosenbaum's 1991 Vanity Fair article paints a very different picture of Casolaro. As per this article, Danny had once reached out to Reed Irvine about a piece on the Watergate scandal. The founder of the infamous conservative media watchdog organization Accuracy in Media, nevertheless felt that he was all bark and no bite.
Saw some of our guests and disagreed strongly with what Dan Rather had to say about the Vietnam War. As a way of an opening, give us an overview of why you disagree with what Mr. Rather said.
Well, I disagree not only with Dan Rather, but thanks, you sent me a tape and I was able to see Walter Cronkite as well. And what struck me, Brian, was the fact that here are the two, I'd say, premier anchors, especially Walter Cronkite, who is the most trusted man in America, and how inaccurate they are, how careless they are with the facts about what went on, specifically at the time of the Tet Offensive.
Rosenbaum quotes Irvine as saying, "But he, Casolaro, never wrote anything for us, and I never saw anything on the subject he ever wrote." Kim Masters' article on Danny gives a similar account of his journalistic abilities. Published only a few weeks after his death, it reveals that records don't support his claim of being part of some of the most important investigative efforts of the last 20 years. Instead, they show that, at most, Danny contributed to small-time publications, such as El Dorado News-Times. This losing streak in journalism might explain why he shifted his focus to entrepreneurship later in life. After acquiring the rights to several computer data processing trade journals, Danny's days of restlessness appear to be over. He was always described as someone who could make a Friday night seem like a New Year's Eve. But now that he was approaching middle age, it was finally time for him to mellow out. His life was about to become even more chaotic. Tired of meeting daily and weekly deadlines, Danny eventually sold his shares in the computer business. It was around this time that his friend Terry Miller, also in the tech industry, put him on the scent of the Inslaw case.
I was a consultant in computer contracts for 27 years in the Washington, D.C. area. I became well known by writing a trade publication called Computer Age. And that's how I met Danny.
Unbeknownst to Miller, he was about to change his friend's life for the worse.
I felt like it was my fault because I had sicked him on the Inslaw case. And I still feel anguish that I did that, but it can't be helped now.
At its simplest, Inslaw was a software company involved in a lawsuit with the U.S. Department of Justice.
Tonight from CBS News, a complex and confusing, still developing case.
It's the story of what happened to Inslaw
that involves improper conduct by high-level Justice Department officials.
It claimed that the DOJ had driven them out of business after stealing one of their highly prized software.
It all started with the software and evolved to a much bigger story.
Inslaw's founder, Bill Hamilton, and his wife, Nancy, had designed PROMIS, short for Prosecutors Management Information System, during America's war on crime in the 1970s.
PROMIS.
New from Inslaw. PROMIS, a powerful new criminal case tracking system. Built to automate the tracking of cases, defendants, and charges in a prosecutor's office. This is the future of justice.
As its name indicates, the software was meant to help U.S. attorneys' offices pull up information such as past convictions, known associates, etc. on individual prosecutions. Basically, their software made the complex maze of the justice system so much easier to navigate.
PROMIS was a remarkably big, effective, powerful piece of software in an era where there were not many big, powerful pieces of software. This software could find relationships of all different kinds between cases. Basically, anybody you want to trace, you can trace with the PROMIS system. We're talking about tracking on a nationwide basis.
Now, while the federal court initially decided in favor of the Hamiltons, their case was ultimately thrown out. Apparently, it had been tried in the wrong court and led the Hamiltons to appeal to the Supreme Court. Amidst this whole fiasco in 1989, top personnel in the La Roche movement approached them. He introduced them to Michael Riconosciuto. Riconosciuto, a self-proclaimed expert on national security, is perhaps the most important piece in Danny's puzzle. But before we reveal why, here's what you need to know about him.
There were a lot of very bad and very dark and very evil people involved in this story. People that Danny couldn't recognize because he had never been around people like that.
In the Inslaw lawsuit, he testified in favor of the Hamiltons. In an affidavit, he told the court that he had gone to Iran with one of Reagan's confidants, Earl W. Bryan. Bryan was Reagan's Secretary of Health and later became the head of United Press International. On this supposed undercover mission, Michael admitted that they paid the Iranian government close to $40 million to delay the release of the hostages. He also attested that after getting him to adapt the software, Bryan had then sold PROMIS to intelligence agencies in different countries, including but not limited to Iraq and Israel. For those of you who don't know, the former conspiracy came to be known as the October Surprise Theory. It's believed to have given President Reagan the edge in the 1980 elections.
Michael told Danny that the PROMIS scandal actually started with Ronald Reagan stealing the 1980 presidential election, the so-called October Surprise.
Bryan refused to admit he'd been involved in such a mission. The court also found loopholes in his confession and dismissed the Hamilton suit altogether. The court cited unreliable sources such as Michael as one of the main reasons for dismissing the case. If you're wondering how Danny fits into all of this, then in the summer of 1990, he was on the couple's doorstep. He wanted to do a piece on their case. That's when he got a hold of the 12-page memo written by Riconosciuto, featuring leads on everything from code names to covert operations. Many believe that it was this memo that set Danny on a path that then condemned him to his mysterious death. As per reports, Danny didn't simply investigate Michael's leads. He got in touch with him, and the two would spend hours talking to each other over the phone. Those close to him recall that in the days before his untimely death, Danny, who had been upbeat, had become reserved. At times, when he did open up, he talked about little else other than his octopus theory. Simply put, encouraged by Michael's ideas, Danny now believed that an international group of intelligence veterans in an Illuminati-like bid were responsible for some of America's biggest scandals. Hot on the heels of this theory, he went to West Virginia on August 8, 1991. A source there had promised him a key piece of information. According to his brother Anthony, only a few days before his death, he'd told him that although he had had a tough going at first, things were finally starting to look up for him. In West Virginia, Danny checked into room 517 at the Sheraton Inn in Martinsburg, an old mill town just off Interstate 81. Unlike most investigative journalists, he had checked in under his name. 2 days later at 12:30, when he refused to open the door to his room, a housekeeper let herself in. What she discovered goes on to confuse authorities and masses alike to this day. In the bathroom, Danny's nude body lay in a blood-spattered tub. The bathroom walls were also splashed with his blood.
And that's when I walked in and saw what I saw. It was just messy.
What was that?
The bloody handprints all over the wall and smeared on the wallpaper and all over the countertop and just blood everywhere.
Once the cops were called, they discovered that he'd slashed his wrists. There were about 4 gashes on his right wrist, whereas the left wrist had between 8 to 12 wounds.
Is there anything that appeared suspicious about this to you?
In my 6 years as a medic, I've never seen anybody ever cut their wrists that many times.
And his wrists were cut how many times?
Well, the left arm appeared to have had 8 cuts, and the right arm appeared to have had 4 cuts.
Some of the other things to be discovered in and around the bathtub were the razor blade that he'd apparently used to cut himself. There was also a half-empty bottle of corked wine with a broken hotel glass beside it. They found an empty can of Milwaukee beer, a glass coaster, and 2 white garbage bags as well. Apart from the gashes, police couldn't identify any signs of struggle on his lifeless body. The blade that they'd discovered, reporters later revealed, wasn't sold locally and was the type used to scrape windows or to unseal packages. From the bedroom, meanwhile, they recovered an empty Mead notebook and a legal pad. Danny had used a bundle from this pad to write his 4-line suicide note. Besides these materials, the police didn't find any other documents. His wallet, which was also among the few things in his hotel room, is what helped authorities confirm his identity. After a local coroner by the name of Sandra Brining had ruled the death a suicide, a urine and blood sample was obtained. The body was then handed over to the Brown Funeral Home. Now, this is where things get a little complicated. Without obtaining permission from Danny's family, the local authorities had his body embalmed. When his brother Anthony, the first to find out about Danny's death, protested this decision, the police told him they'd followed the standard procedure.
I said, wait, has he had an autopsy? No, we don't know that that's necessary. And then I was told that his body had been embalmed.
He was also informed that they had made this hasty decision because they couldn't reach the number on Danny's license. The journalist's suicide note, which wasn't immediately released to the family, read, "Please forgive me for the worst possible thing I could have done. Most of all, I'm sorry to my son. I know deep down inside that God will let me in." However, Danny's friends and family weren't satisfied. They suspected foul play and had some very convincing arguments as to why he couldn't have killed himself.
And they notified me that they had found my brother Danny dead.
Basically what it is we found this guy in a tub full of water with his wrist slit. Okay. And so it's definitely suicide.
Suicide, I was like a little bit taken aback because he had just said to me, if an accident happens, don't believe it.
I remember Danny telling us, If I'm in an accident, if I have an accident, if an accident happens to me, don't believe it, don't believe it, don't believe it.
And so now I'm asking questions, and they're like, well, no, we think it was suicide. I said, wait a minute, suicide. So how do you know it's suicide? Well, that's what the coroner said.
Before Anthony ordered the autopsy that I'll get into in a minute, the suicide angle was rejected for several other reasons. Anthony, for instance, pointed out that a 6-word suicide note wasn't characteristic of his brother. Instead, he would have written a really long letter. In consequence, even though Danny's sister confirmed the handwriting on the note to be his, Anthony demanded a handwriting analysis. If you were to look at his other notes and suicide notes side by side, his sister confirmation checks out. But for a second, if we were to assume that he'd been killed in relation to the octopus theory, then the intelligence agencies have several experts who can forge people's scripts working for them. Another reason why Anthony didn't buy the suicide ruling is because back in the 60s, their sister Lisa had died as a result of a drug overdose after going away to Haight-Ashbury. Even though it was never confirmed if she had committed suicide, the siblings recall how Danny had never really forgiven her. It had also made him anti-suicide. Danny's Catholic upbringing and the years he spent going to Catholic schools also made his suicide seem quite absurd. What's more, Wendy Weaver, Danny's most stable girlfriend, revealed that he couldn't stand the sight of blood. She also thought the suicide angle was improbable because Danny didn't like to be seen in the nude. She said, additionally, he didn't like to be seen naked. To be found in a tub naked, that's not Danny. Anthony somewhat confirmed Weaver's claims by saying that his brother was also afraid of needles, so much so that he wouldn't even let doctors draw blood for examinations. One more odd thing about his death is that the manner in which his wrist had been severed. People in true crime circles have long wondered how he could have used one severed hand to slash the other. His tendons wouldn't have allowed it. For people who suggest that he might have used his teeth, it's a pretty far-fetched idea for someone who'd already slashed one wrist. Let's not forget that he was on the verge of bleeding out as well. Speaking of which, the autopsy didn't exactly smooth over the problems in the case either. The autopsy revealed that there were traces of Tylenol and antidepressants in Danny's blood. Anthony, a physician himself, was confused at this revelation because his brother's medical records didn't show any such prescriptions. To make matters worse, the report revealed that he was in the first stages of multiple sclerosis. The journalist, surprisingly enough, had experienced a range of symptoms, such as the temporary loss of his vision, several severe falls, numbness in one of his legs, etc. prior to his death.
He announced, if I ever couldn't think, I'd kill myself.
And Casolaro's health wasn't the only thing that was deteriorating. A $178,790,000 mortgage payment was due on his home in September 1991.
Experts argue that his fear of blood tests in reality may have been the fear of having his diagnosis confirmed. Another aspect that reporters thought was indicative of his death being a suicide was that he had fallen on hard times. In case you didn't notice, his resume mentions that he's authored a few books. As a matter of fact, most, if not all, sources believe that he was looking into the Inslaw case from a fictional perspective instead of a journalistic one. Whatever the case, Danny took out 2 loans for a book related to the subject. In addition to book agents like Little Brown & Co., Danny had also borrowed money from relatives to finance the manifold trips and long-distance calls necessary for his probes into the octopus theory. However, as we've already explained, he wasn't so strapped as to commit suicide. As per his brother, while Danny was always broke, he always knew that he could come to his family for money. To add to that, he was negotiating the sale of around 5 acres of his land before his death. Had this deal gone through, Danny undoubtedly would have come up with enough money to pay back all of his loans. That he could employ a full-time housekeeper is yet another factor that challenges the despair and suicide angle. The housekeeper reminds us that while he was in Virginia, he received several threatening phone calls at his Fairfax residence. In one of these calls attended by his housekeeper, a male voice informed him that he'd cut up his body and thrown it to the sharks. That's not all. A few months before Danny's death in April of 1991, a Philadelphia attorney, Dennis Eisman, was found dead in his car. Eisman, whose death was also labeled a suicide, was shot point blank while sitting in his Porsche. It turns out before his death he had been in contact with Casolaro. Sources close to the attorney had revealed that he'd been convinced to look into Inslaw and Riconosciuto leads. On the day that he died, he was on his way to meet a woman who'd promised him valuable information related to the case. Unfortunately, his killers got to him before the meeting could take place. Similarly, 2 months after Danny's death, another attorney, Alan Michael May, was reported dead due to natural causes in the San Francisco area. As per Riconosciuto, May, a representative of Nixon's re-election committee, was part of the October surprise as well. Now, while his close ones' feelings were valid, foul play seemed just as unlikely as the thought of him committing suicide. For instance, if we consider that Riconosciuto was the one who inspired the octopus theory, then he should have been taken out alongside Danny as well. Nevertheless, despite serving 27 years in prison after he was arrested for the possession of psychedelics in 1991, no attempts were made on his life. Similarly, and to briefly return to Casolaro's undisclosed and undiagnosed condition, the likelihood of someone who suffers from a terminal illness killing themselves is much higher than that of someone healthy. While we're on the subject of mental and physical health, even though Danny was financially stable in several senses of the word, he was still under a lot of pressure to make something out of himself. A friend of his confirmed this in Rosenbaum's article we mentioned earlier. He expressed how Danny lived in an achievement-oriented environment and was bitter over the sale of his computer journals. By the achievement-oriented environment, we think his friend meant Danny's father and brother, both physicians with big shoes to fill. Perhaps Danny had realized that his pursuit of the octopus theory wasn't taking him anywhere in life, and thus he'd driven to West Virginia to take his own life. Another bizarre yet still convincing angle to his death is that he may have staged it. If you're confused, this would bring his findings the attention he needed. Those who believe that this might be true are also of the opinion that Danny may have been the one behind the threatening calls that were made to his house. All in all, the case is just as confusing, if not more, than the multiple strands that Danny dedicated his life to unraveling. As a result, and at this point, even if you agree to disagree, we think it's time to put the case to rest. Repeatedly revisiting a case such as this can be painful and unethical unless a victim's family wants to. On that note, farewell. Remember to keep your eyes peeled because the world's next biggest controversy might be lurking somewhere near you. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more blood-curdling content.